Welcome. I was reading an article in Scientific American about how much more polarized we are in the United States and how we seem to have shifted into this space, not just disagreeing with each other, but vilifying each other when we disagree, talking about one another as other, talking about one another as these people are good and these people are not just wrong, but they're bad. We've seen this vividly in the United States election. And it seems that hate crimes and this polarization and othering is something that's happening all over the world, but not everywhere in the world. Personally, I've found myself in this state as I scroll through Twitter, and I'm not just disagreeing with ideas, but I find myself feeling disgust and rage, and at least in my own head, calling people names, seeing them as stupid, as bad, as evil. How can you be this way? And finding myself in this place that I don't want to be, of thinking of us as separate. Today, we'll discuss if this is happening in other sectors and spaces and for other people, why this is happening, and how we can change it if that's something that we're committed to do. So we have a fabulous panel today of changemakers working in many spaces and places in the world, and I want to ask them to join. And panelists, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves by answering a question about why is it that you feel compelled to do this work you do of building bridges, of reducing polarization, especially in 2020. Fatima, can we ask you to go first?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. First and foremost, a very happy holiday season, and it's great to be on such an incredible panel with, as you say, Josh, such amazing change makers, some of whom I've had the pleasure to work with. I'll be brief. We need to continue to push for progress. We need to continue to push for peace. Peace in our homes, peace in our countries, peace between warring nations, peace between neighbors, and that's the approach that I take to my work when I work in countering violent extremism, particularly around young people. I was motivated to do that at the age of 13 when I myself witnessed a horrific terrorist incident and felt the harsh hand of violent extremism in my very formative years, and have since dedicated my life to do that through my activism with the Kofi Annan Foundation, and I've had the pleasure to work with Bjørn through that. But why is this so much more important in 2020? Well, a pandemic has thrown the world as we know it into disarray. It's opened up vacuums for violent extremists to do more to hurt our communities in far more incredulous and graphic ways. And similarly with other harms, whereas that's as we've seen with the onset of civil violence across the US with the Black Lives Matter protests. So I'm motivated to continue to push for change and press for peace, despite the challenges that the multilateral world has thrown us, and despite the failings of leaders and governments and institutions that we've put our faith in. So I believe in empowering and inspiring activists and young change makers to be able to take that responsibility onto our shoulders and make that change. Thank you.
Sorry, Martin, how about you? We talked the other day about something similar of what Fatima said about this vacuum. And would you introduce yourself and tell us why you do your work?
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for having me as well. And I chair the Youth Steering Committee at ILGA World, and I work on global level to amplify queer youth voices and strengthen the queer youth civil society infrastructure. Yeah, I think we talked about that vacuum, and I think often queer youth voices, even before the pandemic, were sidelined on global level and on regional level. They were deemed as too political, too controversial to be addressed. And what we know is that in times of crisis, those divides are deepened and worsened as well. And now more important than ever, I think, our work as queer activists, and particularly working on queer youth issues, is to ensure that queer young people are first like not left out from the decision making about that will impact their lives, which they were already left out but now further marginalized, and also that their needs and issues are addressed and dealt with in the right way. And I'm looking forward today as well, because we often, as civil society, we focus on the issues at hand, but also sometimes miss the opportunity to address our role in creating that vacuum we talk about, that really hypercharged the inequalities and also created the populist movements we're dealing with today. Thank you.
And Bjørn, how about you?
It's a good question, and we've had some really good answers so far from Fatima and Martin. I think one of the things that kind of really strikes me whenever we're out or in front of our screens doing the work that we're doing, which largely is to kind of build healthier, more inclusive communities in which people are comfortable with, who they are, but also as a result of their comfort with being who they are, don't feel threatened by someone else being someone else. I think one of the things that we kind of keep forgetting a lot of the time as we are kind of living our lives both on and offline is to listen, and to listen with empathy. And I think one of the things that we learned when working with late Kofi Annan, Fatima and I, was really kind of the value that he placed on getting down on the floor and listening to people when he was meeting with them. There's brilliant pictures of him sitting on the floor among like groups of people and having conversations. And I think that really kind of illustrates a lot of what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to replicate, both at the Khalifa Ihler Institute, which is working for peaceful and thriving communities on and offline, through my work with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which works for creating those public spaces online in which people can freely express themselves without feeling threatened by terrorists and violent extremists. And kind of my latest appointment as of today, working with the Davos Lab Task Force and the World Economic Forum in order to really kind of stake out what the post-COVID world will look like in many ways, trying to put some sort of definition of what the new reality, the new normal shall be. And in that, I think like the things that are important are the celebration of diversity, but also the acknowledgement that that celebration includes listening to people who have different perspectives from you, that are different from you, and then protesting when you're hearing things that are outrageous, as we often do, but also doing that with a humanity and understanding of where people are coming from, not taking everything in bad faith, and certainly not escalating conflict as much as possible, but rather trying to figure out where are people coming from, what is it that is behind what's dividing us, and how can we work to kind of mitigate that in a constructive way, in a way that isn't harmful to society in the future. And I think one of the failures of 2020 has really kind of been the breakdown in communication in many ways, both in the political sphere. We've seen it in Europe, and we've seen it in the US particularly, where things have been very tense around various political elections, not just the US presidential election, but elections here in Europe as well, but also in relation to kind of this shared reality where we don't even agree on whether COVID is real or not, kind of 9 months into a global pandemic. And I think finding that middle ground, finding that shared reality is what drives a lot of my work, and really being conscious of the cost of the loss of that as well, when it manifests in horrendous things. It manifests in discrimination, it manifests in direct violence, it manifests in terrorism, in war and conflict, so many places. And right now, I think the husky is trying to eat my wife behind me, so I apologize for the background noise. That's kind of really where I'm coming from into this.
Thank you, Bjørn, and congratulations on the new appointment. More work for you, but very needed. Satta, how about for you? What fuels your passion?
Yeah. So my name is Satta F Sharif, and I'm a Liberian. But currently I'm in the US for school. But I'm the founder and executive director for Action for Justice and Human Rights. And as an activist back in Liberia, right now, I feel the work that we do is very important, especially during this crisis. With a lot of tension being placed on, COVID-19 and social distancing and everything, less attention is being placed on, fighting sexual gender-based violence and the human rights violation and other, issues that affect especially women and children. So in my country, I know how when the whole COVID-19 crisis started, we were all just, how do we make sure that Liberia, we don't have another, because, we have our experience with the Ebola crisis. And so when the country, when the officials in Liberia were trying to develop like a whole policy for, to ensure that we fight COVID-19 in the best way possible for Liberia. I mean, they didn't take into consideration, sexual gender-based violence. How do we ensure that we continue to run the hotlines for, women and children to report sexual abuse cases? And then during the lockdown, I remember there were like a lot of people going out when they said people should be in. And then there were human rights violations. The authorities who were like ensuring that people should be in, they were the one violating human rights. And stuff like that. And so there I realized that it's not just about how, we come together in a time when everything is peaceful, when we don't have crisis like COVID or Ebola. Even in the middle of the crisis, it's important that we continue to engage. It's important that we continue to hold, lead our leaders accountable when it comes to these things. And we did what we had to do. For us in Liberia, to the young people, whether it was through peaceful protests and social distancing, online campaigns and stuff like that. I remember we demanded the president of Liberia at a point in time to declare rape as a national crisis in Liberia, and we got it done. And so, I mean, it's just important. And I know there was a lot around, people were misinforming people about what the protest was about. They were like saying the whole protest was being politicized and stuff like that. But we had a role to continue to spread information and continue to do what we had to do as young people. So that's why the work that I do right now is important. And especially at the level of Action for Justice and Human Rights. And I'm just excited to be here with all of you guys.
Thank you, Satta. So several of you Satta brought up how 2020 and COVID has disrupted a lot of things. I think some of us hoped that it would create space for change. Bjørn, in one of our previous conversations, said, often in crisis, what happens is we see an escalation in extremism. And I'm wondering, just at a personal level for you, how has 2020 affected your equilibrium and your ability to step forward as the kind of change maker that you're committed to being? Fatima, you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll be very honest with you. At the end of last year, I made myself a promise that 2020 was going to be my year, and I was going to do more and more and more of already what I was doing. And it was just going to be the brilliant start to a new decade. Then came March and everything went into lockdown, and everything, for those of us who are privileged to be in the global north and have access to technology such as this, it was just a case of moving virtual. But I saw cancelled travel plans, I saw cancelled peace missions, I saw cancelled, seeing friends, everything was cancelled. So it was very disappointing, it was disheartening. And then came the death of the murder of George Floyd in the US at the hands of law enforcement. And that jolted me out of that lockdown lull, that jolted me out of that, virtual apathy that I was facing, and reminded me that I don't physically necessarily have to be somewhere to bring change. So overnight, I called Bjørn, I called every activist that I could find, and I said, we need to act. We need to express solidarity from across this side of the Atlantic in Europe to say that we stand united against racism, that we stand united against the persecution and the oppression of people of color at the hands of institutions of power. And nowhere in this world, particularly the US, the beacon of democracy and liberalism, should this be tolerated, particularly in a year where lives have been lost indiscriminately, when people have suffered mercilessly at the hands of an unknown virus. Enough is enough. And in the space of overnight, 24 hours, we had 100 activists willing to support an open letter campaign that we had kicked off. We were writing to the Attorney General in the US to say that we do not accept violent extremism. We do not accept racism based on, against the African American population, and that we express solidarity as fellow people of color and also change makers. We did the same with lobbying the European Union to adopt a resolution that for the first time in its history acknowledged white supremacy as a cause of violence in Europe, acknowledged the impact of colonialism on subjugated communities, and finally said that we support and stand in solidarity for Black Lives Matter. So this year, in a way, it went from me having lofty ambitions to those dissipating overnight with global lockdowns, to then a very unfortunate incident happening to then kick me back into activity, and to remind me that irrespective of where we are in the world, the plight of people, the persecution of people, and the oppression of people is not to be tolerated, and that it is up to us as a global community, as a global citizenry, to do our most to support others.
Martin, how about for you? I know you've had some very personal challenges with COVID this year. How has 2020 affected you?
Yeah, I think I'll be very honest as well, and I think for me, like, COVID was personal from the beginning of the year, and it started with losing my dad and my friend. And I think it was, since then, like, the whole year is very different. And I think, and you found yourself as a young person as well, and a lot of young people around the world, and including myself, navigating grief in ordinary circumstances, and very extraordinary circumstances. That you don't have the normal networks, the normal processes of grieving as well with people. And on the other hand, what you have is that you don't have the usual people around you that will support you through that process. So I was by myself, because that's so all myself in living by myself and dealing with how I had to. Sorry, I think you can't hear me, so I'm just gonna. Sorry, I think my internet's a bit. Sorry. I hope you can hear me now better. But yeah, and for me, it was it's a challenging experience. While meanwhile, I had to continue my global work with working with queer youth and setting up the new global queer youth network for the first time that we've set up, and working with on a lot, organizing a lot of queer youth work internationally. And I think a lot of activists found themselves, including myself, burning out really quickly. And because you don't have anything else going, you're stuck in your house by yourself, you can't leave the house, you're grieving, but also you have responsibility for your activism work. So you have to one point stop and you say, okay, what about me? I still haven't really managed to deal with my personal injustices that I face, but I'm still already fighting these global injustices. So it's just how very personal things became intertwined with my work very quickly and put everything into perspective. Yeah, and I think for me, this year has been change everything that I know of my work and put it into a comparison as well to how we should, regardless of what challenges we are facing, should step back and look after ourselves, because we're no good for our communities if we're not ready to have that for time for ourselves. But yeah, that's from me. Hope you can hear me. Just let me know.
Yeah.
Make sure.
Yeah, when your mic is closer, it's great. Satta, I'm curious for you. There are other people who I've spoken with who've been living in countries which is not their normal home, and in this pandemic feeling really isolated. And I'm wondering if for you, especially with the human rights violations that you were seeing at home and in your temporary home, how did that affect your feeling of isolation and support?
A lot. I think this entire crisis and being away from home, this is like the first time where I had to stay away from Liberia for a long time. Initially, I was hoping to go home, at the end, right after the end of my first year in school, and then with the crisis, and then my country, they closed the airports and everything, and just staying in the US, I was like, how do I do this? Where do I start from? I'm not used to, just being quiet and not doing anything. And so it was a lot of redirecting my efforts, recreating, and the interesting thing about this, like Fatima or one of the speakers said, it's not just about, being present, at the moment. You can be far away and still, impact or still be able to contribute to what is happening. And it took me a while for me to realize that I can still be able to help in a more effective way, even when I'm out of Liberia. Because when I'm in Liberia, I'm either organizing protests or attending meetings or attending awareness sessions, and just being there, that one youth that is always there and stuff like that. And so being in the US and not being able to contribute, I remember when the George Floyd incident happened, I attended several of the protests because, of course, I couldn't just stay home. I was online and sharing some of the other activists' work and everything. And I mean, there were a few Liberians who attended the protest, and some of them got arrested. And so as a Liberian, I was like, how can I support my fellow Liberian, other young people that are getting involved? And so all I had to do was to continue to share online and continue to reach out to people who could help those that were, being arrested and stuff like that. And also go to the protest, but in a more safer way, social distance and everything. And so another issue started to happen. I realized in Liberia that though there were a lot of attention on the George Floyd case, there was a lot of attention on COVID-19 and stuff like that. In Liberia, the country closed the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. And it was kind of shocking for me that the activists back home, other people back home, people are not talking about it, and there was a lot of warning about sexual abuse going on the increase, when people are in isolation and everything, how we there's a lot of risks involved. How do people report these cases and stuff like that? And there was no attention. And so I wrote a letter initially to the ministry, and I didn't get a response. And so since I was away from home, I couldn't do all the physical stuff. I took the media. So I had an interview with one of the newspapers in Liberia, And then it was just like a public warning to both the ministry and the government, calling their attention to kind of think about opening the Ministry of Gender and think about formulating a plan for, sexual gender-based violence, because you don't want to be in the middle of a crisis and what if someone get abused? Who do they even report to if the social workers at the Ministry of Gender are not working? They are not even working from home, because the ministry was listed as one of the non-essential institutions. Can you imagine? And so I know how I got a lot of attack, and people are like, hey, we need to pay attention to the important things and stuff like that. Before we knew it, the number of sexual abuse cases started increasing. And of course, what I did was I reached out to other activists and other people who were on ground in Liberia, and they started having the conversations as well. And they started reaching out to other activists, and before you know it, the minister came and released a statement, include the Ministry of Gender. I'm just saying this to say that you can be far away and still, impact and still continue to do the work that you do. And so just being aware, it took me a while to realize that. And before we all gather ourselves together as young activists in Liberia and started the 3 days protest, both online and in person. I mean, I just realized how powerful it is for young people when they come together and work together and demand change in a more peaceful and organized manner. No matter, the challenges, no matter who's attacking you or calling you troublemaker as a young person, it's very powerful. And I learned a lot during this crisis by just, staying fine and doing what I had to do.
Thank you, Satta. Bjørn, I'm curious about this connection piece. And, of course, your work for years has mostly or largely involved sitting in front of a computer. And, so in some ways, maybe there wasn't that big a change. And yet I know that, when you and I were talking earlier this year, I think you were also feeling that sense of like lost connection. And I'm curious what helped you feel reconnected and kind of maintain that grounding.
So yeah, it's been a strange year when it comes to the concept of connection, even, right? I think like in prior years, I had a pretty grueling traveling schedule. My computer was not on my desk, but rather in my lap as I was sitting in airports around the world, kind of flying from meeting to meeting, and meeting with people in person certainly is a very different experience than meeting with them online. And I think one of the first things that happened once the lockdown kicked in was that I posted to a Facebook group that Josh and I both are members of, and about kind of what do we do now? Because there's a network of changemakers, of people who are working for social impact, and we've been so dependent for so long on jetting around the world at a really kind of growing pace, in a really eco and friendly way, to meet, to advocate, to work with policymakers, to work with other change makers from around the world as well, right? And so the question is kind of when you suddenly can't do that anymore, when the border here was closed overnight, and suddenly we had like military personnel along the border between Sweden and Norway that's been demilitarized since the Second World War and has been, no big deal to cross. Like, what do you do when you can no longer travel and work in the way you normally do? And so for me, it was really about kind of figuring out how to transform that work that we've been doing for the last decade into something that works online. And what I've found is that there's ways of being a lot more impactful in many ways online. We've managed to do things like work with Fatima on the policy for the European Parliament, having the parliamentarians declaring that Black Lives Matter. That's amazing work, and it wouldn't necessarily have happened at least not in that way, any other year. And that's because we managed to connect online, but also because we felt a different level of connection, I think, to what was going on far away, really, in Minnesota in the US, which is, a place I've worked in the past, but not a place I'm frequenting too much. And so kind of being able to share kind of this global idea of what's going on, both in terms of Black Lives Matter and in terms of what's been happening on the climate front, what's been happening when it comes to the pandemic, what's been happening when it comes to various conspiracy theories that's been really harmful surrounding things like elections, both in the US and beyond. In many ways, we are more connected as kind of a global community because all this is happening online, and because it is, just set up a Zoom call and you're there. And at the same time, it's missing that interpersonal link where, we've worked together for a year now, Josh, and I've never met you in person. I realized in November that it's been a year since the last time I saw Fatima, who is one of my closest colleagues. That is very strange at the same time. Another kind of level of the connection philosophy really is, when I was traveling, I kind of lost the connection to myself in many ways, and it was exhausting, and I was really burnt out by that. I kind of had this house in the Swedish forest in a very Henry David Thoreau-esque kind of way, I had never really spent more than about a week here in a row, and I had no connection to this place whatsoever. And so being kind of hunkered down in one location, it's also been extraordinary to get to grow that connection to the place and to myself in some sort of way. And that's also been really kind of empowering and been very useful in being able to kind of amplify and grow my work. And so in many ways, it's been a way of growing both the reach and the work itself, and growing kind of these connections in a really beautiful way, even though it's been also, of course, a very challenging year, and a much more challenging year for many than for me. And it's important to acknowledge that as well.
And you got a dog.
Yeah, which is playing in the
background. I hear in your voice this combination of grief and peace, and I really resonate with that. I have not been home for this many weeks in a row in 15 years. And it's actually, there's something really wonderful about it. And there's something very disconnecting and something very connecting. And I think that paradox of those things at once is hard to reconcile. And maybe it'll take us a while. I want to turn to a topic of a term called common memory. And there's a quote from George Erasmus, a Dene Aboriginal leader, who says, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community." And I heard several of you talk about this sense of global connectedness, this sense of being connected across oceans, across continents, around the world. And yet, Erasmus says, where we if we're going to form community, the quote is, "Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." And Aboriginal activists are talking about this idea of common memory as a way of saying we need to reconcile our story, that we have a shared story, because right now maybe we don't. Fatima, maybe we'll go back to you. What would it mean to you what would it take to build that common memory, that shared story of who we are?
Thank you, Josh. I think that's an incredibly important question. And before I answer your question, I'm going to take it back 10 years ago, where the last decade I entered feeling incredibly sad. And it feels like I entered this decade feeling incredibly sad. And what I mean by that is sad about the state of our world and the state of global affairs. And I point out that at the offset of the last decade, there was extreme hope in the Middle East. The Arab uprisings, the Arab Springs, the revolutions, whatever we wish to call them, the now civil wars in some places, represented so much hope for a generation of young change makers that the regimes of Hosni Mubarak, Ben Ali, Bashar al-Assad, and others in Libya and Tunisia, would fall, and democracy would pave the way for progress, transformation, and that common humanity. And what we've seen in the case of in Syria in particular, which is very close to my heart, that deeply upsets me to this day, is that hope hasn't materialized. The international community has failed Syrians. We have failed to cultivate a common humanity. We have failed to cultivate a common memory, and we have failed the 16 million. I believe when I read this week, the number of Syrians and Middle Easterns from that region who have been displaced as a result of civil strife and civil war, and we have failed to hold the great imperial powers who use the Middle East as their proxy and their playground. And I point my fingers to Russia and the US and even the United Kingdom in some regards, for failing to uphold their end of the bargain to help and support these people as being the great defenders of liberty and human rights. So that's the context in which I approach this question. A decade of turmoil, a decade of civil strife, and a decade of difficulty. But am I still hopeful? Yes. Do I have hope in institutions and global leaders? No. But do I have hope in the Bjørn Ihlers and the Martins and the Sattas and the Joshes and all the people listening in the world? Absolutely yes. Because it is our generation who can cultivate that common hope. And it is often uncommon hope and uncommon stories that have the power to bring people together. And that's why I really want to emphasize in my contribution today, that irrespective of the failings, we must hold on to hope. We must continue to strive to build that common understanding and that common humanity, because we are one human race. Thank you.
Martin, in many ways, in this decade that Fatima described, the work that you've been involved in has made huge strides. Many countries around the world legalizing gay marriage, for example. And yet, do we have common humanity?
Yeah, I think, you're right. We've made so much progress in so many areas in the last decades in so many aspects. We just actually, ILGA World just published this Tuesday our flagship report, which is the state-sponsored homophobia report. And we still know that 69 countries internationally criminalize who we love. Despite having so much progress, we're still seeing a lot of negative tendencies in terms of like people pushing back and going backwards in terms of criminalizing sexuality, or attacking trans communities, or removing legal protections, whereas in Poland and Hungary, Indonesia, it's all across the world is happening, and that has been hypercharged during the pandemic. So when we speak of like common memory, it is really difficult as queer people to see it sometimes, because we are denied our existence. We don't see ourselves represented in global spaces, regional spaces, local spaces. We are surrounded in a world that, sometimes works against us and denies our existence or denies our rights. So I think there is also another aspect of this common memory. If we're in order to achieve, we need to tackle something, is that we see it more that we've entered this era of something worse, obviously, than capitalism, as Yanis Varoufakis was saying recently, and is that it's is a hyper individualism that, you know, all our rights and freedoms are sort of about individualistic rights, right? Everything that's about community focus, that is about empathy, or it's about sharing values, or like common goal, it's like immediately deemed as something that, you know, sometimes is framed as extreme and it's like, and something that we are scared of, or like sometimes it's just framed as something impossible. For us, I think it's really important to, like, as queer activists, but in general as young activists, is that to bring this perspective is that there is alternatives, and because that's the common notion that we can see around us a lot of the time at the moment, is that no, there's no alternative than this hyper individualistic society that is hypercharged by corporate greed. No, there is, and for us, our role as young activists is bringing that perspective, despite being called too naive, too optimistic, or like dismissed on global level, is for us to break down those barriers and take those spaces that we have been denied. Because we know is that young people are extremely underrepresented in decision making globally. We have, despite having the youngest population in the world in any generation at the moment, only under 2% of our leaders are under 35. And that's worse for marginalized communities. That would be worse for LGBTIQ people, that would be worse for people of color. And we know that young people will live with all the consequences we're doing that. For us, in order to have common agreement and common value, we need more voices in those decision making. And if leaders really, like you said earlier, current leaders can't step up or lead or follow what we're doing, they really need to get out of the way, because the activists that are down on the ground, that are bringing those passions, they have the alternatives and the solutions, but we're just not listening to them and not giving them the space.
In terms of common memory, and one of the pieces you and I talked about the other day, Martin, I was just thinking about gender and gender pronouns, and like our whole, in some ways, our archetypes, our stories of history, our narratives, our novels, are like, there's a very strong, gender norms are very strong in our stories of the past. And it seems like it's a space where, is it overstated to say that trans people or people who are not gender conforming were just kind of written out of the history of humanity?
Well, we actually, when we come back to it, all those norms and all those anti trans kind of rhetoric is deeply connected with colonialization. As like when you look back in history, you know, if we are talking about in indigenous cultures and across the world, whether it's in India with Hijra communities, or whether it's in the Pacific with Fa'afafine, or whether it's in Native Americas with Two-Spirit people, like transgender diverse people have been celebrated throughout history. They've been integral part of the communities. And suddenly this narrative that appears nowadays as if something trans and non-binary is something new is dangerous. And actually, that's why when we had this conversation, for us is important when we talk about like LGBTIQ rights or any forms of injustices, is to talk to step back and see, oh, okay, where is this all coming from? Because often they are linked with all those systemic issues that we're dealing with. Is that of highly patriarchal post-colonial society that we are dealing with, and those heritage that we still have to deal with. Like, we know that the Penal Code in Britain made homosexuality illegal in 2/3 of the world, and still countries are working on repealing that. And I think sometimes we lose the memory, and sometimes what we've created is that these kind of external legislation, these external demonizations for like communities have become as if they're the part of the culture when they're not. And I think we need to bringing more of those to lights and to celebrate the people in the past, but also the current people that we're working on. And I know people want to separate and create divisions at the moment, because we see this anti-trans rhetoric appearing to particularly on global level. But actually, no, the majority of people, I strongly believe that, of feminists and of LGBTIQ people are pro-trans and are celebrating and sharing a common vision, but often are not given enough space. It's those anti-trans voices and those voices that attack our community are given the platform, because that sells often on the media and that attracts attention, but it gives them validation, which is not often the case because they don't represent the majority.
Well, I know we could get into a very long conversation about this, but I want to touch on social media, Bjørn. And how is what Satta just described earlier, Fatima described, Martin described, how is that being helped and hurt by the algorithms and the profit motives of social media?
So I think, first of all, one of the things that I keep repeating over and over in so many conversations is that we are stories that we choose to believe about ourselves and about our relationships to the world. Like, essentially, when it comes down to like what is your identity, it's largely about kind of stories that are you choose to tell about yourself, or stories that it's kind of how you present yourself to the world and how the world is interpreted as well by the stories that we listen to. And therefore, there's enormous defining power in who gets to tell those stories. And there's ways in which those stories can be really damaging, where, you know, I, because of the stories that have been told to me, see someone as the other, see someone as the enemy, etc. And there are stories that are helpful and healthy that we can, you know, tell each other. And one of the amazing things about stories is that, you know, we are all free to tell them, and we can all kind of change them as well. It's just a matter of you know, defining power, which exists so much within the sphere of media and also within the sphere of social media. And the question there is really kind of what stories gets told and who gets to tell them and who gets heard, and who listens and who gets to listen to who. That is at this point so controlled by, you know, various interests. And some of that is really harmful in some sort of way, and some of it is really positive in other ways. We have seen enormous growth in things like citizens journalism, where, you know, young people have been able to, you know, run out to the streets with cell phones and make videos that change the world of events. Like we saw that, like George Floyd is one example, but we saw it during the uprisings until 2011. We've seen it kind of grow a lot since then. This idea that we're all kind of part of the global media in some sort of way. But we also see that people are using these kind of tools that have been used to create great change, to create really harmful things. And we also see that quite often the harmful things are winning out in terms of clicks and views and reactions. And I think one of the things that social media is designed for is to be addictive, and it's designed to keep you tapped in, and a large reason for that is the ad revenue model that a lot of the companies behind this are built on, but that also informs things like the algorithms showing you what they think is likely to keep you on the platform. And a lot of the time that's based on what receives the most comments, what receives the most reactions, and all of the times the things that get the most reactions is what's most outrageous, really. Like it's a model that's entirely or well, more or less built on creating outrage. And if you want to win the algorithm, as people are talking about, you know, create something that is entirely out there, and people will hurl abuse at you, but also you'll find, you know, a lot of supporters in some sort of way, which is really strange.
Well,
this is kind of the mechanisms behind it.
Even the term reaction.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been trapped in this world of this so long that's built into kind of our native language.
We want everyone to react right now. Press the like button, right? I mean,
and it's creating a very kind of black and white way of viewing the world. It's a very binary way of viewing the world, because everything essentially boils down to essentials. First of all, it boils down to 280 characters on Twitter. It boils down to what someone will take their time to read, or not even read, but read the headlines of. It boils down to what's the thumbnail image on a YouTube video, not even what is the content of the YouTube video. What is the thumbnail is the important bit. And, with so little information, it's so easy for us to retreat to our base biases as human beings, as our cognitive wiring is not meant for processing information in this way. But at the same time, it's really effective in the addiction place of it.
So moving us towards that superficiality.
Yeah, and so the question is really like, how do we introduce complexity? And how do we introduce nuance? And how do we introduce healthier conversations in ways that don't boil down to the really identitarian and harmful conversations, or the really biased and polarized conversations? Like, how do we find the space to have the conversations in the middle ground when our core instincts are being played upon by those who don't necessarily have our best interest in mind when they're designing the spaces that we exist and have our conversations with them? That's a question for the century, I think. But it's really about kind of changing public space in so many ways. We talk a lot about social infrastructure, creating spaces for conversations, for meetings, for bringing people together. And it's a really difficult thing to do.
We have billions of dollars being spent to push us towards superficial, reactive, low oversimplification. And then we have this void that Martin and Satta talked about. What do?
We get building.
I want to ask a closing. We're out of time. I have two more questions I wanted to ask. So speed round. What is your purpose now? And what is fueling you to continue to grow your purpose? So speed round, 10 words or less. What's your purpose? And then another 10 words. What's fueling you to strengthen your purpose? Who's ready? Satta.
I can. I think with all that I've seen and with all that is happening across Africa, specifically from Nigeria to Liberia, in Namibia, Cameroon, the violence, a lot of young people are being denied the chance to be young, a chance to education, equal rights, and all of these things are happening. And we've seen how bad leadership in Africa is kind of impacting the way the continent is being viewed, both outside and within the continent. And young people are rising up, and just seeing every day how young people are standing up to some of these, leadership in Africa, embracing their voices and demanding change every day. I think that's the core of everything right now. I mean, and it's inspiring to watch, how everyone is somehow finding their voice and demanding change. And I'm just hopeful that we can continue to have this conversation about reaching out, about sharing compassion for each other, and about, equal rights and justice at all levels. And as a young person, I know it's hard every day waking in the morning and hearing different things, especially for me in my country. Every day I wake up, there's either this whole confusion between political parties about this other idea when it should be paying attention more to the issues of young people, to the issues of equal rights and justice and everything. It's sad, but it's also hopeful on the other end to see young people standing up and speaking out and everything, and that's the most important thing for me. In much as we continue to demand change and see these change happening and be a part of the change, that's just it for me.
Who's next? Martin?
I mean, I will be short. I think for me, it's always been just justice for all people and our planet. And I think what's driving me is the injustice, really. And it will always be. And I think my personal experience for injustice has always be fueling that fires, that I don't want the next generations to feel similar things or to see similar things, or and to avoid, and hopefully that their bodies, their rights, their identities and lives of all young people are protected and respected on global, regional, and local level.
Bjørn?
I think it gets down to the essentials of building spaces in which diversity can thrive, in which we can celebrate who we are and live together in peace and learn from each other and grow together and evolve.
Fatima?
Echoing what everyone on the panel has said, my purpose is to continue to be that professional disruptor, that maverick, that rebel, that defender of rights, who fearlessly, along with my fellow panelists, advocates for change, social justice, and peace and harmony. And that is by continuing to hold those in power to account, telling them, if you are not willing to stand up, step aside, because we are willing to do that. So take action, and I hope everyone is safe and secure for the coming year. Thank you very much.
Well, what I hear is that in some ways, pain and the suffering is actually driving this call for justice. The forces that are pushing us apart are calling you to come together. And that feeling that there is a common humanity, you can feel it. And even though people are denying it, you can feel the truth of it. So thank you all for your huge efforts in 2020 to stem those tides and to forge those connections. And I'm looking forward to 2021, where we hopefully will have a little bit of an easier time with those connections and being together in the work that we're trying to do in the world. And for all of you watching, thank you for being here. Thank you, panelists, and we'll see you next year.
If this was helpful, would you please comment, like, share, and subscribe? The Emotional Intelligence Network is your community to grow and practice EQ. At 6 seconds, that means being smarter with feelings. And we're here to provide practical, proven EQ tools so workplaces, schools, and people can thrive everywhere in the world. Be sure to visit 6seconds.org to find the complete suite of resources, assessments, and programs. Thank you for watching.